Welcome to the show, everyone. I'm Naomi, your host, and today we have a very special guest, Anna. It's so great to have you here, Anna. How have you been? I'm enjoying a lovely cup of jasmine tea as we chat.
Hi, Naomi. It's wonderful to be here. The weather outside was so crisp today. Walking through the cool breeze felt refreshing.
I know what you mean. There's something calming about the autumn air, right? It's perfect for chatting about business over a cup of tea.
Exactly. I can already feel the warmth of this conversation, just like the tea warming my hands.
Speaking of warmth, let's dive into today's topic, business English, and how to communicate effectively with colleagues.
Sure, Naomi. When I first started working, I was so nervous about speaking English at meetings. My hands would get clammy, even if I was holding a hot cup of coffee.
I totally understand. It's like the room suddenly feels colder, even though it's just your nerves kicking in. But over time, it gets easier, right?
Absolutely. Now, I enjoy the challenge of expressing myself in English, especially in business settings. It's like finding the missing piece to complete a puzzle.
That's a great way to put it, and today we're going to help our listeners find those pieces by sharing some practical phrases they can use at work.
Yes, I'm excited to dive into that. Business English can seem complicated at first, but once you break it down into smaller, useful phrases, it becomes much more manageable.
Exactly. We'll start with some key phrases that are often used in meetings. These are great for clarifying points or making sure everyone is on the same page.
That's perfect. It's so important to ensure clear communication in meetings, especially when things can get a little chaotic or fast-paced.
Yes, absolutely. Let's start with one phrase I personally use a lot. Could you clarify that point for me? It's polite, but direct, and very effective.
I love that one. It's perfect when you're not quite sure what someone meant, but you don't want to sound like you weren't paying attention. It keeps things professional.
Exactly. And another good one for meetings is, let's recap what we've discussed so far. It's a great way to summarize and make sure everyone is aligned before moving forward.
Yes, that's super useful, especially when discussions get long or detailed. It helps to reset and make sure everyone's following.
Absolutely. And once you've recapped, you can always follow up with, shall we move on to the next topic? It's polite and keeps the meeting flowing smoothly.
That's great. It's also good for making sure everyone's ready to move forward without rushing anyone.
The first time I used the phrase, could you clarify that point for me? It was during a really intense project meeting. We were working with a client who had a completely different communication style. I was so worried that asking for clarification might come off as unprepared, but the client actually appreciated it.
I can imagine. Sometimes we worry about asking questions, thinking it might make us look like we're not paying attention. But actually, it shows that we're engaged and trying to understand everything clearly. I had a similar situation during a call with a senior manager. I was nervous, but when I asked for clarification, he said, "Thank you for asking. I was worried I hadn't explained that well." It was such a relief.
Exactly. It's amazing how just one simple question can change the whole tone of a conversation. And that brings us to our next phrase. Let's recap what we've discussed so far. I used this one recently when we were running out of time in a meeting. We had covered so many topics, and I felt like the team was losing focus. Summarizing helped everyone get back on track.
That's a great idea. I've noticed that too, especially in longer meetings where everyone's throwing ideas around. Without a recap, people can forget what was even discussed an hour ago. I once had to lead a brainstorming session, and after about 45 minutes, everyone was lost. So I stopped and said, "Let's recap," and you could almost see the relief on their faces.
Oh, I can totally picture that. Sometimes it's not about moving faster, it's about making sure everyone is still on the same page. After all, clear communication is the foundation of any successful business.
Absolutely. Clear communication is key. And it's not just in meetings. Even in everyday office situations, it's important. I remember once I was working on a project, and there was a deadline approaching. One of my colleagues kept sending emails with vague instructions. I could feel myself getting frustrated, but instead of letting it build up, I decided to approach him directly and ask, "Could you clarify what you need from me?" It wasn't easy at first, but the conversation that followed cleared everything up.
That's a great example. Sometimes it's not just about what's being said, but how it's being communicated. I had a similar experience when I was coordinating with different departments. The emails were piling up, and every message seemed to have a different tone, so I decided to stop relying on written communication and walked over to their desks. I said, "Let's talk this through in person." It was amazing how much smoother things went when we had a face-to-face conversation.
Oh, I love that. Sometimes we get so caught up in emails and messages that we forget how much can be solved with a simple conversation. I had a similar moment when I was trying to finalize a report with my boss. The email thread was getting ridiculously long, so I just knocked on his door and said, "Shall we review this together?" It saved us both a lot of time. And the report turned out much better because we could brainstorm ideas in real time.
Exactly. And that phrase, "Shall we review this together?" is such a polite but effective way to suggest collaboration. It's great for making sure both parties feel included without stepping on anyone's toes.
Naomi, one thing I think about often in the workplace is the issue of gender discrimination. Even though things have improved over the years, it still feels like there are subtle barriers that we, as women, have to navigate, especially in business settings. Have you ever felt that way?
Absolutely, Anna. I've experienced it many times, especially early in my career. I remember being in meetings where my ideas were overlooked until a male colleague repeated the same point, and suddenly it was acknowledged. It was frustrating, but at the time, I didn't know how to address it.
I can completely relate. It's those small, everyday moments that can feel so disheartening. I've had similar experiences where I'd be the only woman in the room, and it was hard to feel like my voice mattered as much as the others. It's not always blatant, but those subtle signals can wear you down over time.
Exactly. And what's frustrating is that when we do speak up about these experiences, we're sometimes labeled as too sensitive or overreacting. It's almost like there's no winning. If we stay quiet, the behavior continues. But if we address it, we risk being seen as difficult.
That's so true. I've often felt that tension, wanting to stand up for myself and other women, but also not wanting to be seen as the troublemaker. I think what's important is that we find ways to support each other, to create environments where these conversations can happen openly and constructively.
I couldn't agree more. It's crucial that we have allies in the workplace, both men and women, who are willing to listen and challenge these outdated norms. Sometimes, just having someone back you up in a meeting or acknowledge your point can make a world of difference.
Yes, having that kind of support can be empowering. I've noticed that when one person speaks up, it often gives others the courage to do the same. It's like breaking down a wall, brick by brick.
Exactly. And I think the more we have these conversations, the more we can create a workplace where everyone feels valued and respected, regardless of gender.
Speaking of creating a respectful workplace, we can't ignore the issue of sexual harassment. It's something that, unfortunately, still happens far too often in many companies. Even though there are policies in place, the fear of speaking up can be overwhelming. Have you ever had to deal with situations like that?
Yes, unfortunately I have. There was a time earlier in my career when I experienced inappropriate comments from a colleague. It wasn't overtly aggressive, but it made me incredibly uncomfortable. The worst part was feeling like if I reported it, I would be seen as overreacting or making a big deal out of nothing.
I've had a similar experience. It's that feeling of being trapped, like you can't win either way. If you say something, you risk being labeled as too sensitive. But if you stay silent, the behavior continues, and you carry the weight of it. It's exhausting.
Exactly. It creates such a toxic environment where you're constantly questioning yourself, wondering if you're overreacting or if it's really that bad. But over time, you realize that even those seemingly small comments or actions can chip away at your confidence and sense of safety in the workplace.
That's such a powerful point. Even the small things can add up, especially when they happen regularly. And what makes it worse is when the culture of the workplace either ignores or, in some cases, subtly encourages that kind of behavior. It can make you feel isolated, like there's no one to turn to.
That's so true. I've been in workplaces where it felt like certain behaviors were just part of the culture, comments about appearance, or jokes that crossed the line. And because it was so normalized, speaking up felt almost impossible. You worry about being seen as the one who can't take a joke or is too uptight.
And that's what's so damaging. It's not just the harassment itself, but the culture that allows it to continue. It makes you feel like your only option is to ignore it or laugh along, even when it's hurting you inside. But we shouldn't have to tolerate that.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture where respect is the norm, and where people feel safe speaking up without fear of backlash. That's why it's so important to have clear policies, but also to have leaders who actively support those policies and create an environment where everyone is treated with dignity.
Yes, leadership plays such a critical role. When leaders demonstrate that they won't tolerate any form of harassment, it sets the tone for the whole organization. It empowers people to speak up, knowing they'll be taken seriously.
Exactly. And when more people feel empowered to speak up, it not only protects individuals, but also helps to shift the culture towards one of respect and equality. We all deserve to work in an environment where we feel safe and valued.
Speaking of workplace dynamics, there's another topic that can be tricky: office romance. I think it's something that people don't talk about openly enough, even though it happens all the time. I've personally been in a situation where I dated someone from work, and to be honest, it wasn't as straightforward as I thought it would be. Have you ever experienced something like that, Naomi?
Yes, I have. I was in a relationship with a colleague for a while, and it was one of the most complicated experiences of my professional life. On the surface, everything seemed fine. We kept things professional at work, but there was always this undercurrent of tension. I felt like I had to constantly balance my personal feelings with how I was perceived at work.
That's exactly how I felt. We tried to keep things professional too, but even the smallest things, like deciding where to sit during a meeting or how much we interacted in front of others, became complicated. It was like we had to put on this performance every day, making sure no one thought anything was going on. But deep down, it affected me emotionally, and sometimes it was hard to focus on work.
Exactly. It's that constant balancing act, trying to maintain a professional image while also managing your personal feelings. And the worst part was when we had disagreements outside of work. It was nearly impossible to leave those feelings at the door when we stepped into the office. Sometimes, even a simple meeting could feel tense because we were still upset from a personal argument the night before.
Oh, I've been there. It's like you're carrying all this emotional baggage into a space where you're supposed to be focused on work. And it affects everything: how you communicate, how you collaborate. For me, the hardest part was trying not to let my coworkers notice. I didn't want people to think I wasn't being professional. But inside, I was struggling.
I know what you mean. The worst was when rumors started spreading. Even though we tried to keep things private, people eventually picked up on it. Suddenly, everything we did was scrutinized: how we talked to each other, even how we greeted each other in the morning. It created this weird atmosphere, and it made me feel even more isolated.
Yes, that's one of the biggest challenges. Even if you're doing everything right, the perception of others can still change. And once people start seeing you differently, it's hard to shake that off. It's like there's always this invisible pressure, and it can be exhausting.
Exactly. In the end, the relationship didn't last, and when we broke up, it was even more difficult to navigate the workplace. We still had to work together, and it was awkward for a while, but I learned a lot from that experience about boundaries, about communication, and most importantly, about protecting my own emotional well-being in the workplace.
I completely understand. I went through something similar, and after that, I realized how important it is to set clear boundaries and to really think about the potential impact before getting involved with someone from work. It's not always easy, but learning how to navigate those situations has made me stronger, both personally and professionally.
You know, Anna, one topic that often feels taboo, especially in professional or public conversations, is sex. It's a natural part of life, yet it's often surrounded by so much secrecy and discomfort when discussed openly. Have you noticed how differently people react when the subject comes up?
Absolutely, Naomi. It's something I've noticed too. Sex is a fundamental part of being human, but society often treats it as something we shouldn't talk about. I've found that it can create this weird double standard where we're expected to be comfortable with it but also not talk about it too much. It's like we're constantly walking a fine line.
That's exactly it. There's this pressure to appear open-minded, but at the same time, we're judged if we bring it up too openly, especially as women. There's often a fear of being labeled or misunderstood, which can make it difficult to even have honest conversations about something that's so normal and important.
I completely agree. It's even more complicated when you think about how sex is portrayed in the media. Hypersexualized in some ways, but at the same time, real conversations about sexual health, consent, and emotional connection are still lacking. There's so much focus on the act itself, but very little on the broader context of intimacy and relationships.
Exactly, and that lack of balance can lead to so many misunderstandings and unhealthy expectations. When I was younger, I remember feeling confused about what sex was supposed to mean because the messages I was getting were so mixed. It wasn't until much later that I learned to see it as something that's deeply personal and should be based on mutual respect and understanding, rather than what society or the media portrays.
I can relate to that. I think a lot of people have gone through that same confusion, especially because we're often not taught how to have healthy conversations about sex. There's so much shame attached to it, which makes it hard to talk openly even with partners. But when you think about it, sex is such an important part of relationships, and being able to communicate about it is key to having a healthy connection.
I've learned over time that being able to have honest conversations about sex, boundaries, and consent with a partner is crucial. It's not just about the physical aspect, but the emotional and psychological side too. Being in a space where both people feel comfortable enough to express what they need and how they feel can deepen the relationship in ways that go beyond just physical intimacy.
Exactly, and I think that's where a lot of the fear comes from. People worry about being judged or misunderstood when they open up about what they want or need in a relationship. But the more we can normalize these conversations, the healthier our relationships can become.
That's so true. At the end of the day, sex is just one part of a relationship, but it's a part that can reveal so much about communication, trust, and mutual respect. The more we can approach it without shame or fear, the more fulfilling our relationships will be.
You know, Naomi, jealousy is something I've definitely struggled with in the past. It can be such an overwhelming feeling, especially when it sneaks up on you unexpectedly. I remember there was a time at work when a colleague got promoted, and even though I was happy for them, I couldn't help but feel jealous. It was frustrating because I didn't want to feel that way, but it's like, it just took over.
I know exactly what you mean. Jealousy is one of those emotions that feels so irrational sometimes, yet it's so hard to control. I've been in that situation too, watching others succeed while wondering why it's not happening for me. Even when you know logically that everyone's path is different, those feelings of jealousy can still creep in and make you question yourself.
Exactly. And it's even harder because there's this sense of guilt attached to jealousy. Like you feel bad for feeling it, which only makes it worse. I remember thinking, why can't I just be happy for them? But at the same time, I was feeling left behind. It's such a conflicting emotion.
Yes, that guilt can really eat away at you. I've felt the same way, especially when it's someone close to you, like a friend or colleague. You want to be genuinely happy for them, but there's this part of you that's thinking about your own progress or lack of it. I think it's important to acknowledge those feelings, though, because pretending they're not there just makes it worse.
That's such a good point. I think acknowledging it is the first step in dealing with jealousy. When I finally admitted to myself that I was jealous of my colleague's promotion, it was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. From there, I could reflect on why I was feeling that way and focus on what I could do to improve myself, rather than letting the jealousy consume me.
That's such a healthy approach. Jealousy can be such a destructive emotion if we let it control us, but when we face it head on, it can actually teach us a lot about ourselves. I've found that when I'm feeling jealous, it's often a sign that there's something I want but feel like I'm not getting. It's a reminder to check in with myself and see where I need to focus my energy.
That's so true. It's almost like jealousy is a signal that we need to pay attention to what's missing in our own lives. Instead of seeing it as a negative emotion, we can use it as a tool for self-reflection and growth. It's not easy, but I've found that when I approach it that way, I can turn those feelings into motivation to work harder on my own goals.
Exactly. It's about shifting the perspective. Instead of letting jealousy bring us down, we can let it push us forward. It's all part of learning how to manage our emotions in a healthy way, both personally and professionally.
You know, Naomi, there's something I've never really talked about openly, but I think it's time. A few years ago, I found myself in a situation that left me really confused about my feelings, and it shook me deeply. I had developed feelings for my female boss, and for the first time in my life, I started questioning my own identity.
Wow, Anna, that sounds like such a heavy and confusing experience. It must have been difficult to process those feelings, especially since it was your boss. How did you handle it at the time?
It was overwhelming, to say the least. She was someone I really admired. Smart, confident, and incredibly kind. I always looked up to her as a mentor, but then things started to shift. I found myself thinking about her constantly, and it wasn't just admiration anymore. There was a moment, late one evening, when we were working together on a project, and our hands brushed. It sounds so small, but that brief touch sent a shock through me. I realized that my feelings had crossed a line I wasn't ready for.
I can imagine how that moment must have felt. It's one thing to admire someone, but when it crosses into romantic or physical attraction, it completely shifts your perspective. Did you feel like you were falling in love with her?
Yes, I did. And that realization terrified me. I had never had feelings for a woman before, and it completely threw me off balance. I started questioning whether I had been suppressing something all my life. Was I really attracted to women? Was I LGBT? It felt like my entire identity was unraveling. I remember looking at her during meetings and wondering if she noticed the way I felt. The worst part was that I couldn't talk to anyone about it. I was too scared of what they might say, too afraid of being judged.
That must have been so isolating. I can't imagine the weight of carrying those feelings alone, especially when they're so confusing and new. Did you ever feel tempted to tell her how you felt, or did you keep it completely to yourself?
I thought about telling her so many times, especially during those late nights when it was just the two of us working side by side. There were moments when our conversations would drift into personal topics, and I'd find myself almost confessing, but I couldn't do it. I was terrified of ruining our professional relationship and, more importantly, of her reaction. What if she didn't feel the same? What if it made things awkward, or worse, jeopardized my career? So I kept it all inside, which only made the feelings stronger.
I can't imagine the intensity of those feelings. It must have been so hard to be that close to her, yet feel so far away in terms of what you could express. Did you ever get any sense that she might have felt something similar, or was it all just inside your head?
There were moments where I thought maybe she felt something too. The way she would look at me sometimes, or how she'd go out of her way to help me with projects, it made me wonder. But then I'd second-guess myself, thinking I was just reading into things. In the end, I never really knew, and that uncertainty made everything more intense. It was like I was constantly on edge, wondering if something more was going on between us or if it was all in my head.
That uncertainty can be so consuming. It keeps you in this constant state of emotional limbo. Did you ever come to any conclusions about your feelings, or was it something you just had to move on from without really resolving?
There was a moment, Naomi, where everything nearly came to a head. It was after one of those late nights working together. We had just finished a big project, and she invited me out for a celebratory drink. I remember feeling so on edge, my heart was racing the whole time. We sat in this dimly lit bar, the sound of soft jazz playing in the background. She was so close to me, and I couldn't focus on anything but her. It was like the room shrank, and suddenly, it was just the two of us.
That sounds so intense. Being in that kind of setting, with all the emotions you were feeling, it must have felt like everything was leading up to something. Did you know then what might happen?
I think, deep down, I did. The conversation was light at first, but there was this unspoken tension between us. She touched my arm a few times as she laughed, and each time my skin felt like it was on fire. I remember the way her perfume lingered in the air, a soft, floral scent that felt intoxicating. My whole body was reacting to her without my permission. I felt my breath quicken, and my hands trembled slightly, but I tried to hide it.
That kind of physical reaction can be so overwhelming, especially when you're trying to keep control. But it sounds like everything was building up to that moment, like something was bound to happen. What did she do next?
She looked at me, really looked at me, and there was something different in her eyes. The air between us felt heavy with unspoken words. Then she leaned in, just slightly, and I could feel the warmth of her breath against my skin. I felt frozen, like my entire body was suspended in that moment. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. Everything felt sharper, the clinking of glasses behind the bar, the soft rustle of her clothes as she shifted closer. And then, before I even realized what was happening, her lips brushed mine.
That must have felt like the world stopped for a second. What was going through your mind in that moment? Did everything change the second her lips touched yours?
It did. Time seemed to slow down, and I was completely consumed by the feeling of her lips on mine. They were soft, gentle at first, but there was an electricity that passed between us, like nothing I had ever felt before. My body responded immediately. My skin tingled, my pulse raced, and I could feel a warmth spreading through my chest. It was like every nerve in my body was alive, buzzing with sensation. I wanted to pull her closer, but at the same time, I was terrified. This was my boss, and crossing that line felt like stepping into unknown territory.
That mix of desire and fear must have been so overwhelming. It's like your body and mind are pulling in two different directions. Did you pull away, or did you let yourself stay in that moment?
I stayed in the moment. I didn't want it to end. My mind was racing, telling me to stop, to think about the consequences, but my body wouldn't listen. I leaned into the kiss, and for that brief moment nothing else mattered. It was like we were the only two people in the world. Everything around us faded, and all I could feel was the warmth of her skin, the softness of her lips, the taste of wine lingering between us. It was intoxicating, and I was completely lost in it.
That sounds so powerful, like a moment you'll never forget. But I imagine that afterward, the reality must have hit hard. How did you feel once the kiss ended?
The moment the kiss ended, reality came crashing back. It was like the bubble we were in had suddenly popped, and all the thoughts I had been pushing away flooded my mind. My heart was still racing, and I could feel this rush of adrenaline, but at the same time, panic set in. I pulled away from her, and the look in her eyes changed. She looked just as shocked as I felt. The air between us turned cold.
That must have been such a conflicting moment. One part of you is still caught up in the intensity of what just happened, and the other part is realizing the consequences. Did you talk about it with her afterward, or did you both just try to pretend it didn't happen?
We didn't talk about it right away. We just sat there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing what to say. I could still feel the warmth of her lips on mine, but the silence between us was unbearable. Finally, she cleared her throat and said, "I think we should go." That was it. We walked out of the bar, and everything felt so surreal, like I was watching myself from the outside.
That must have been so difficult, not knowing what to say or how to act after such an intimate moment. Did you ever get the chance to talk it through with her later, or was that the end of it?
As we left the bar, the cool night air hit me, and it was like a shock to my system. The warmth of the bar, of her, was still lingering on my skin, but the coldness outside snapped me back to reality. We walked side by side down the dimly lit street, the sound of our footsteps echoing against the buildings. I could feel my heart still pounding in my chest, my mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. I kept glancing over at her, hoping she would say something, anything, but the silence between us was heavy.
That kind of silence can be unbearable, especially after something so intense. It's like both of you are trapped in your own thoughts, unable to break the tension. Did you want to say something to her, or were you too afraid of what might happen if you spoke?
I wanted to say something so badly, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, and every time I opened my mouth to speak, I just couldn't. There was this overwhelming fear of ruining whatever fragile balance we had left. So I kept quiet, my body feeling like it was vibrating with unspoken words. Every step we took felt heavier, like the weight of what had just happened was pressing down on me.
That's such a powerful image, feeling like your body is carrying the weight of everything unspoken. It's amazing how much tension can build when we're afraid to voice what we're really feeling. Did the walk help you clear your mind at all, or did the silence just make everything feel more intense?
Anna, if anything, the silence made it worse. The longer we walked, the more the tension between us grew. My body felt like it was on high alert, every nerve ending hypersensitive to the cold, to the sound of her footsteps next to mine, to the quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. I could feel my hands trembling slightly, and I tucked them into my pockets to hide it. But inside, it was like a storm. So many emotions swirling around, and no way to let them out.
It's incredible how silence can amplify everything. Your thoughts, your feelings, even the physical sensations in your body. Did the walk help you clear your mind at all, or did the silence just make everything feel more intense?
We eventually reached her building, and that's when things came to a head. She stopped at the entrance, turned to me, and for a moment I thought she was going to say something. But instead, she just looked at me, really looked at me, and it felt like she was waiting for me to make the next move. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. The cold air felt sharp against my skin, but my whole body was burning with everything I wanted to say and do.
That kind of tension, where both of you are on the edge, waiting for the other to do something, can be unbearable. What happened next?
After we stood there for what felt like an eternity, she finally broke the silence. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I think we should leave it here for tonight." I could tell she was trying to keep things calm, but her eyes were still searching mine for some kind of understanding. My heart sank, but at the same time, I knew she was right. There was too much at stake to keep going, and I was just as scared of what could happen if we didn't stop.
That must have been so hard, standing there with so much unsaid and yet knowing it was the right thing to do. How did you feel in that moment? Were you relieved, or did it just leave you with more questions?
It was a mix of both, really. On one hand, I felt this immense sense of relief that we didn't cross a line we couldn't come back from. But at the same time, I was left with so many questions about her, about myself, and about what this all meant. The weight of those questions settled in as we said our goodbyes. We stood there for a moment longer, neither of us moving, as if we were both waiting for the other to change their mind. But eventually she stepped back, gave me a small, sad smile, and turned to walk away.
That small, sad smile must have said so much without words. It's like you were both acknowledging the connection but also the reality that came with it. Did you feel any urge to call out to her? Or did you know deep down that letting her go was the right thing to do?
There was definitely a part of me that wanted to call out, to ask her to stay, to talk about what had just happened, but the logical part of me knew that there was no way we could figure everything out right there in the street. It was too much, too soon. So I just watched her walk away, each step she took feeling like 1,000 miles. The moment she turned the corner and disappeared from view, I felt this hollow ache settle in my chest. It was like something had been left unfinished, and I wasn't sure if it would ever be resolved.
That feeling of something being left unfinished, it's such a hard thing to sit with. Did you feel like that was the end, or did you have any hope that you might be able to talk about it with her later?
At the time, it felt like the end. The weight of everything, my feelings for her, the fact that she was my boss, the uncertainty of how she felt, it all seemed too complicated. I didn't see a clear way forward, and that terrified me. But a part of me still held on to a small hope that maybe, somehow, we could talk about it later, when things weren't so overwhelming. I wasn't sure how or when that would happen, but I wasn't ready to let go completely.
It makes sense. Sometimes, we need distance to process everything, and maybe time would give you both the clarity you needed. Did you eventually get that chance to talk, or was it something that just lingered in the background?
We did eventually talk, but it took a while. We both needed time to figure out how we felt and what we wanted. When we finally sat down to discuss it, it was like reopening a wound that had barely healed. But at the same time, it was necessary. We had to confront what had happened and decide how to move forward, both personally and professionally.
That sounds so familiar. It's strange how things can just quietly fall apart, without any big confrontation or closure. Did the distance between you grow gradually, or did it feel like you both actively avoided each other after that night?
It was gradual, but there was definitely a shift. We didn't actively avoid each other, but the closeness we had before just wasn't there anymore. We kept things professional, always polite, always composed. But the warmth that used to be between us was gone. It felt like we were both just going through the motions, not wanting to address what had happened. And as the project wrapped up, so did our interactions. Once the work was done, there was no real reason for us to spend time together anymore, and that's when the distance really started to grow.
It's amazing how relationships can just fade like that, without any big argument or dramatic ending. Do you think that deep down, you both knew it was for the best, or was there a part of you that wanted to hold on to it?
I think a part of me wanted to hold on to it, to see where things could go. But at the same time, I knew it was complicated. She was my boss, and crossing that line further could have made everything so much messier. The silence between us was painful. But, in a way, it also made things easier. It gave us a way to quietly step back from something that neither of us was ready to fully confront.
That makes sense. Sometimes, silence can be a way of protecting yourself from something you're not ready to deal with. Do you feel like you got closure, or was it something that just stayed unresolved in the background?
I don't think I ever really got closure, to be honest. It just faded away, and while that made things easier at the time, it left a lot of unresolved feelings. I sometimes wonder what might have happened if we had actually talked about it, but at this point I've accepted that some things just don't get the neat endings we hope for.
I think that's a really important realization that not everything gets the resolution we want. Sometimes, things just fade out, and we have to learn to live with the unanswered questions. But even though you didn't get the closure you hoped for, do you think that experience changed you in any way?
It definitely changed me. It taught me a lot about boundaries, about emotions, and about the complexities of relationships, especially in a professional setting. I also learned to trust my instincts more. Even though things didn't end the way I might have hoped, I think stepping back from the situation was ultimately the right choice for both of us. It wasn't easy, but sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that teach you the most.
That's such a valuable takeaway. Sometimes we want things to work out a certain way, but the reality is, walking away or letting something go is the healthiest option, even if it leaves us with questions. Do you ever find yourself thinking about her now, or have you completely moved on?
Every now and then, I do think about her, but it's more like a memory from another time. It doesn't hold the same weight it once did. I've moved on, but that experience will always be a part of me. It's one of those chapters in life that shaped me, even if it didn't end the way I imagined.
It sounds like you've really found peace with it. I think that's the most important thing, to come to terms with those experiences and carry the lessons forward, even if they don't end neatly.
Exactly. It's all part of growing and learning. Not every story gets a perfect ending, but they all teach us something in the end.
And that's what makes life so interesting, isn't it? The unexpected twists and turns, and how we navigate them.
Absolutely. It's all about how we handle the moments that don't go according to plan.
I couldn't agree more, Anna. Life is full of unexpected moments, and it's how we handle them that defines us. Thanks so much for sharing such a personal and meaningful story with us today. I'm sure a lot of listeners can relate to the complexity of relationships and the lessons that come with them.
Thank you, Naomi. It's not always easy to talk about those moments, but I think it's important to reflect on them and share our experiences. Hopefully it resonates with someone out there who might be going through something similar.
I'm sure it will. And for those listening, remember, no matter what you're going through, every experience teaches us something. It might not make sense in the moment, but eventually, it becomes part of your journey. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back next time with more stories and insights. Until then, take care and keep learning.
Thanks for listening, everyone. See you next time.